Okay, so what we're looking at, 4.7 today. Still going to solve like we were doing yesterday. Yesterday we looked at solving two ways. Either we were going to solve with factoring or we were going to solve using square roots. And this is one today that y'all have seen it before. Just going back and remind you of it. This one you're going to solve using the quadratic formula. Yeah, I heard somebody go, But compared to the option we were doing yesterday with completing the square, all the steps on that one, this one is actually a little bit better. So, good thing is it's pretty similar to some stuff we've already done. Okay, so there's your formula. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all that's over 2a. Okay, and for that one, it's kind of like yesterday that if we were going to solve this one with factoring, you had to have equal to 0. Same thing for this one. If you're going to do the quadratic formula, it's got to be equal to 0. So if it's not set equal to 0, just add or subtract the parts to the side till you get it to the point where that it is equal to 0. Okay, now two things in this one that you want to kind of notice. You've got the plus or minus that's here in the middle. And yesterday when we used the square root property, how we had to do the plus or minus thing, so that one's kind of bringing in the square root part of it there. And I don't know if you ever noticed this or not, it may be one of those things that just because we went over it in the last chapter or the first part of the test there, if you take out this square root part that's here, you got negative b over 2a. Is that ringing a bell with anybody? It's when we were finding the vertex, right? So this is kind of where it all ties together, that when we had the negative b over 2a, well, that's the vertex part of it. You know, if you have this quadratic formula, this part back here is just the extra part that we kind of get to find out what the zeros are going to be when we're going through this thing. And here's basically what it is. Because some people are kind of get confused sometimes about what to do and when to use it. I always tell people, if you can do something factoring, because factoring is going to be a whole lot quicker most of the time than doing the quadratic formula. So you're basically going to do this. You're going to use the quadratic formula when you cannot factor. And so it's basically like it's a last-ditch effort kind of a thing. That you want to do factoring first because it's going to be quicker, it's going to be faster, it's probably going to be a lot easier. But if you get a problem and you're not able to factor it, then this is what you want to go back and do. Okay, so let's just give you a problem here. Show you what it would be. Okay, so let's say you've got x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Okay, first thing is it is equal to 0, so we're good there. Once you've got it there, then you go back and look at your numbers. Now, honestly, here's what you're supposed to do. And I'm telling y'all ahead of time that even if the problem says use the quadratic formula, the very first thing I would do is I would look and see if you could factor this thing first. So are there any factors of 6? And don't write this down, let's just kind of talk about here. Are there any factors of 6 that would equal 5? It would, wouldn't it? You know, 1 and 6 won't work, but 2 and 3 works. We'd have a positive 3 and a positive 2. We'd have the factors and we would go with it. So that's one of those problems that even if they tell you to use the quadratic formula, if you look at it, I always tell people, look at it first and see if you can factor it. If you can, don't do the quadratic formula because you're just making it harder on yourself. For this one, we're going to look at it and say, all right, let's just say that it didn't have any, so we can kind of look at it and see. And then the next one we'll make it where you're not able to use the quadratic formula. This one, just so the numbers work out nice and easy, we'll show you how this one works. Okay, so the first thing is your A value is 1. Your B value is 5. And your C value is 6. Okay. And test-wise, I'm not going to ask you. There's going to be some parts where I'm going to say, all right, just solve this thing ever how you want to do it. That if you can factor it, you can factor it. If you're not able to factor it, then you're going to have to use a quadratic formula. Okay, and then start plugging in. And I would say when you're plugging in the numbers, kind of like we did on the finding the vertex, when you plug in the B and the A's in here, put everything in parentheses when you plug in the numbers, because that seems to help people out when they're plugging in the numbers for this part of it. So x is going to equal -5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 6. And that's all over 2 times 1. Oh, sorry, let's let me see better. There we go. Okay, now it may be overkill, but it's better to be overkill and be correct than to not be overkill and be wrong with the parentheses. So I would say if you're not sure, every single time you plug in an A, B, or C value, put it in parentheses, and that'll be safe. Especially, sometimes people miss this very first number, especially if there's a negative here. So, you know, just to be on the safe side, just go ahead and put more parentheses in than you think you need. So that one's a -5, plus or minus. 5 squared is 25. And if we do 4 times 1, that's 4. 4 times 6 is 24. And that's all over 2. Okay, so that's -5. Plus or minus, well, 25 minus 24 is 1. But that one works out nice because the square root of 1 is 1. Okay, now here's where you have to split this part off, kind of like we did when we were solving. Oh, when we're doing the square roots, how we had the perfect square numbers, how we had to separate it. Where we had one was a plus and one was a minus. This one, it's kind of in the same thing. That once you get to this point, you want to look at it as almost like two different problems. This one we're going to do -5 plus 1 divided by 2. This one we can do -5 minus 1 divided by 2. Okay, so if you do -5, I'm going to kind of work it to the side here because we're off room here. If you do -5 plus 1, that's -4 divided by 2. And then -4 divided by 2 is a -2. Okay, for the other side, -5 minus 1 is a -6. Divided by 2 is a -3. Okay, and there's your two solutions at -2 and -3. Okay, and going back to the part that we said yesterday, is that anytime you start with, and come back in a second, if we start with x squared, you have to have two answers. So there you go, there's your two answers. So anytime we start with a quadratic, anytime you start with x squared, you have to have two answers when you're going through these. Okay. So that's the basics of what we're going to do. Now, again, that one, I picked that number problem just so that when we got to the end that this square root came out perfectly, everything was nice, and everything just worked out great. We're going to look at one here in a minute where it's not going to be that number doesn't come out to be a perfect square root. That we're going to have to kind of work on it and tweak it a little bit. Okay, but before we do that, let me show you one other little thing here. That we know we're kind of going back to the formula back up here. That the -b over 2a was the vertex part of it. If we took out the square root that's here. So what they kind of do is they tell you, all right, well, if we know that -b over 2a helps us find the vertex, they kind of say, all right, well, this b squared minus 4ac, it's kind of its own special little thing. And what b squared minus 4ac is, they call that the discriminant. Because that's really when you're doing the quadratic formula, that's where all the work is. Because the -b over 2a, you multiply by 2 on the bottom and you change the sign on the top. So that part of it's not any big deal. All the work that you do in that formula, 90% of it is inside that square root right there. So they say, all right, well, since we're doing all the work with that, it's got its own special little thing that it is, and they call that the discriminant. And here's basically what it is. That if you do b squared minus 4ac, if you just take that part of it and plug it in, and some of the homework, they're going to ask you the same thing. They're going to say, all right, tell me what the discriminant is. We're not going to worry about anything else, just worry about the inside of the square root part. Work this part out, and if that answer is positive, then it's all right. Well, then we've got one thing that's in common with every single time that's positive, whether that's 1 or 100 or 1,000 or 15 or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. If that number is positive, you will have two solutions. So if b squared minus 4ac is a positive number, you're going to only have two solutions. Because you're going to take the square root of it, and you'll have the plus and the minus for that part of it. Now, when we start graphing these, if you have to graph these parts of it, here's basically what that means. If you have two solutions, what that means is that the graph intersects the x-axis 2 times. That those two, when you get those two numbers, like when we got the x equals 2 and the x equals 3 on the last problem, that basically means those are x-intercepts, is really what those are. That when you get a solution, that's basically like an x-intercept. So for this one, because you're going to get two answers for x, that's two different answers, then it's going to hit the intersection of the graph 2 different times. Okay, so here's what this. All right, so that's if it's a positive number. We'll get the two different. And for that part, we are going to get two answers, but it's going to be two different answers. It'll be 2 and 3, or 4 and 5, or 6 and 12, or it could be a half and 2/3 even. But you'll get two different answers. If b squared minus 4ac, if you plug that in and that comes out to be 0, you only have one solution. And same thing for up here. That means the graph is going to intersect the x-axis 1 time. Okay, and somebody's saying, well, I thought you said we'd always get two answers. Well, we do, but if that discriminant is 0, if it was negative b plus or minus, that number was 0 on the inside over, let's just say it was 2 times 1. It could have been negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 0. So that if that b squared minus 4ac is 0, that's 0 on the inside. What happens when you take the square root of 0? Just 0, right? So is there anything such as a positive or a negative 0? No, it's not, right? It doesn't matter if it's positive. It's just 0. It doesn't have anything. So basically, that part goes away, and it's just negative 4 over 2, and then you've got your answer that's there. So this is kind of, I won't say it's a trick question, but if that's 0 for that part, that means that this point you get is also the vertex. So it's kind of like a package deal. If the vertex is also on the x-axis, it only hits it one time. Okay, and then we got one other option here. Because you either get positive numbers, you get 0, or you're going to get negative. There you go. Got to have negative numbers. So if b squared minus 4ac is negative, you have no real solutions. So went from having 2 answers to having 1 answer, now you've got no answers. Because, if you take the square root of a negative number, your calculator says, I'm not going to do it. And if you have no real solutions, that means the graph doesn't touch the x-axis. Okay, so the number of solutions you have always matches up with how many times you're going to touch the x-axis. And those are basically your x-intercepts. So when we're solving on the last equation we had back here, when we solved x equals -2 and x equals -3, that's telling us where this graph is going to cross on the x-axis. It's going to hit the x-axis at -2. It's also going to hit the x-axis at -3. And then we do the negative b over 2a from the other part of this back here, and that tells us where the vertex is. And then we've got the numbers we need to graph this thing. So it's basically just a different way to kind of add some details to the graph, that now we're adding a couple more details to the graph if we need them for this thing. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Just going to basically ask you to find out what the discriminant is. And we're not going to graph. We're just going to find out what the discriminant is, and then we're going to plug it into the quadratic formula and see what we get. So good thing is we're not graphing these. We may graph them a little bit later in a different chapter, but for right now in this section, we're not worried about doing any graphs here, because we did enough graphs in the last part of it to kind of get us through everything. Okay, so here we go. Here's for the examples we've got to do, here's the directions on it. So it should say something like this. Find a number of solutions using the discriminant. And then it's going to say something like this. If you have solutions, name them. Because, again, if you do the discriminant and that number is negative, you don't have any solutions, so there's nothing to actually find for that part. Okay, and we'll do 3 or 4 examples of this one just so you can kind of see how it works, and just keep playing around with the discriminant. And we'll work on the square roots a little bit at the same time too, so it's kind of working on all the parts and pieces over here. Okay, so very first one, we'll go with x squared minus 6x equals 10. Okay, so whether you're going to factor this or if you're going to use quadratic formula, because right now we really don't know which one we're going to do, you've got to get this 10 over here to the left-hand side so that this part will equal 0. So we've got x squared minus 6x minus 10 equals 0. Okay, now, and again, here's what you still have to find the discriminant. So for that part, we're going to have to go ahead and do that one. That once we're here, the a value is 1. The b value is -6, and the c value is, make sure you use a -10. If you use a positive 10, it's going to throw things off. So make sure it's all set to one side. And that's where we're going to pull the a, b, and c values from. Okay, so if they tell you have to use the discriminant, that's part of the answers that, it's going to be like in the homework where you got like a 2 or 3 part question where that you got to get that part of it first. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and do b squared minus 4ac. Plug that in and see what we get. And again, every time you plug those numbers in, put them in parentheses. So you've got -6 squared minus 4 times a times c. Okay, so -6 squared means that's going to be 36. -4 times 1 is -4, but then -4 times -10, that's a +40. Okay, so there's, if they ask you to tell what the discriminant is, there you go. Your discriminant 76. But the more important question is that number, it's positive, right? Which means if this thing is positive, you have to have two solutions. Okay, and that's the one thing the discriminant does, is it tells you if you need to do anything else. If this had been like a negative 76, that's when you could stop and say, all right, if that's negative, I don't have any solutions, I'm done. I don't have to plug this thing in the quadratic formula. There's no solution to this thing, and you're done. If it's positive, well, now they're saying, all right, well, if this is positive, now you've actually go back and work this thing out and see what it would be. The good news is that once you've got the discriminant, the hard work for this problem is done. Because we've got to plug it into the quadratic formula. But you just told me that b squared minus 4ac, that what's inside the square root is 76. So you don't have to do anything with that part. It's just minus negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 76 that we got from this answer. And that's over 2 times 1. So if they make you do the discriminant first, you've done all the hard work for this problem, because now it's just minus a negative 6. Well, that's a 6. We've got the square root of 76, and we'll work on that part next. And that's over 2 times 1, which is just 2. Okay, here's where we're going to kind of back up to yesterday, because we haven't done anything with square roots, right? Simplifying them. I think yesterday I just kind of forgot that we hadn't done that part. So here's what we've got to do. With the square root of 76, this is where you're going to have to start breaking this thing down. And this is where we kind of do the factor stuff. This is where we kind of go doing the factors. But you just need one set of factors. And I always tell people, if you're not sure about a number, if it's even, you can always divide it by 2. So go ahead and take 76 and divide it by 2. That should be 2 times 38. And 2 is a prime number, so that one's as far as that'll go. 38 is also an even number, so you can do it as 2 times 19. Well, 2 is a prime number, so it's good there. And if you check 19, there's nothing you can do to break down 19. 2 won't go into it, 3 won't go. If it's an odd number, you can only check the odd numbers. So 3, 5, 7, none of those numbers work, so that one's also prime. So for 76, it's 2 times 2 times 19. Okay, and if you haven't done square roots in a while, this is where it's like finding Nemo. You got to find an exit buddy. And to be an exit buddy, it's got to be the same one. So you got a pair of 2's. So the 2's have an exit buddy, so the 2's get out. And the 19 is in there by itself, so it stays in there by itself. So it's 2 squared to 19. So if they ask you to put it in the simplest radical form, that's where you just break the number down by dividing it by 2's and 3's and 5's until you get them all broken out, and everything has to come out in pairs. So if you get a pair of 2's, it's got an exit buddy, they get to get off the EAC and sail off to Sydney Harbor. Okay, so that square root of 76, we can make it 2 square root of 19. And it's over 2. Okay, now here's where they're going to ask you to go that one more step and kind of break it up into different parts. That it's everything divided by 2, you actually have to kind of separate the parts. That it's 6 over 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 19 over 2. This 2 that's on the bottom, this number that's on the bottom, it needs to be separated so it's underneath both parts. Because now you've got some things you can simplify. 6 divided by 2 is 3. The 2's will knock each other out here and leave you with the square root of 19. Now, if they have the plus or minus button on the homework, and again, sometimes they give you that option and sometimes they don't. If they have that plus or minus button, you can leave it like that. if they don't have the option for the plus or minus button, then what you'll have to do is one time you'll have to do 3 plus the square root of 19, and the other time you have to do 3 minus the square root of 19. So either one of those two answers is okay. And again, sometimes they've started adding the plus or minus button in the homework, but I don't think they've done it in every section. So if they don't have that plus or minus button, you have to actually separate it. One time do a plus, the next time do a minus. Okay, and again, there's our two answers. That's in simplest radical form. If they ask you to make it into a decimal number, then you just punch those numbers in your calculator and tell me what the decimal number is. And they'll tell you to round it off to 2 places or 3 places or whatever they ask you to do there. Okay, let's do a couple more of those. Maybe even 3 more, because we'll get one that goes pretty quick here in a minute. Okay, let's go with x squared plus 4x minus 3 equals 0. Now, and again, if they didn't ask for discriminant, a lot of people would go, hey, well, I can do that because the factors of 3 are just 1 and 3. If I do 1 plus 3, that gets me 4. Well, here's where you got to be just a little bit careful, though. We're finding the factors, if you try to factor this, it'd be the factors of negative 3, correct? And the sum's got to be positive 4. Well, there's only one way you can do it, it's 1 and 3, but if that first number, b term, is positive, that means the bigger number over here has to also be positive. What's a negative divided by positive? It's got to be negative, right? So can you do negative 1 plus 3 and get 4? No. So the numbers look good, but the sign, that one sign is off with the 3, so for this part of it, it does not factor. It looks like it should, but it's that one sign that's off right here. So you're not able to factor this one, so you have to use the quadratic formula. But again, they ask you to find the discriminant first. So we need b squared minus 4ac. So the a is 1, the b is 4, and the c is negative 3. All right, so plugging that in. Again, put the numbers in parentheses. We've got a 4 squared minus 4 times a times c. Some people say, well, I didn't need the parentheses with 4 because it's positive. Yeah, but let's just get in the habit of doing that, because if it's negative, sometimes people will kind of miss the negative there. 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4, but a negative 4 times a negative 3 is a positive 12. So that means your discriminant is 28. Okay, we've got the number, but the big thing is that 28 is a positive number. And if the discriminant is positive, that means you have to have 2 solutions. Okay, so they'll probably ask you, when you go through the homework, it's probably going to be about 3 parts of check on this thing. They're going to ask you probably first what the discriminant is. Okay, now that you've got this number, tell me how many solutions you have, whether it's 2 or 1 or none. And they're going to say, all right, now tell me what it is. And they'll give you an option to list the solutions, and they'll probably have a check box where you can just check off that there's no solution. Okay, so we know we got to find the 2 solutions. So we got to do negative b, plug it back into the whole quadratic formula here. But again, the big thing is that we've already done all the hard work here. So now it's just minus 4 plus or minus the square root of 28. And that's over 2 times 1. Okay, so we've got the negative 4, you've got 2 times 1, so really we've just got to break down to 28, and we'll do that on the side right here. Okay, so 28. Again, keep it simple when you're breaking these down. If some people are like, I don't like doing all these. Okay, well, let's just start easy. It's an even number, so do 2 times 14. Again, 2 is a prime number. 2's, 3's, and 5's. That's your big 3 prime numbers. If you can get 2's, 3's, and 5's, that's the main ones you're looking for. All right, 14. That's an even number, so it's 2 times 7. 2's prime. If you check 7, it's also prime because there's nothing that will divide into 7. So there's 28. It's 2 times 2 times 7. And again, if we're doing square roots, everything you're looking for pairs. Well, there's your exit buddies. Your 2's get out. The 7 doesn't have a buddy, so it has to stay on the inside. Okay, so we're taking that square root of 28 after we break it down and make it 2 square root of 7. Yeah, and then from there, then we've got to simplify the rest of it. Because we've got negative 4 over 2. We're also going to have the 2 square root of 7 over 2. That whatever that number is that's here, you got to break it up into 2 parts and see if you can simplify any of it. So we've got negative 4 over 2. Well, that's negative 2. The 2's will cancel here, and that leaves you with 1 square root of 7, or just square root of 7. Okay, and again, if you have the plus or minus button, and sometimes you do and sometimes you don't with the homework, you can leave it like that, or you may have to actually split it up as negative 2 plus the square root of 7, or negative 2 minus the square root of 7. All right, we're going to do 2 more, and these will be shorter, I promise. Okay, so example 3, we'll go with 3x squared minus x plus 5. Okay, it equals 0. So we're good for that part. We don't have to move anything around. So from that part, just tell me that your A value is 3, your B is negative 1, and your C is 5. Okay, so all we need is the B squared minus 4AC to figure out what the discriminant is first. That is negative 1 squared minus 4 times A times C. And again, don't be stingy with the parentheses, because sometimes the parentheses will be your best friend to make sure you get the right number, because if you've got one sign off, that's going to make all the difference in the problem. If you do negative 1 squared, that's always going to be a positive 1. We've got negative 4 times 3, that's a negative 12. Negative 12 times 5 is a negative 60. If you do 1 minus 60, that's a negative 59. Okay, so your discriminant is negative 59, and since it's negative, that means you have no solutions. There you go, and you're done. So if you check your discriminant, if it comes out to be a negative number, you don't have to do anything else. You can say, all right, that's a negative number. If I plug that in and square root it, it's not going to give me a real answer. It's going to say domain error on the calculator, which means nothing else to do. That's it. You're finished. Okay, and then one more. Let's go with 2x squared minus 4x equals negative 2. Okay, very first thing is, again, it's got to equal 0. It doesn't, so we've got to add 2 to both sides. So we've got 2x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. Okay, so discriminant-wise, we've got the a value is 2, b is -4, and the c value is 2. So we're going to plug that into b squared minus 4ac and see what we get. Alright, so that's -4 squared minus 4 times a times c. And the thing about b squared, it always has, because it's b squared, the first number always has to be a positive number, because it's, even if it's, in this case, a negative. If you square a negative number, it's going to make it positive. So it's going to be 16. -4 times 2 is -8. -8 times 2 is a -16. So if you do 16 minus 16, that is 0. Okay, and if your discriminant is 0, then that means that you only have, there you go, one solution. Okay, and when we're doing the one solution, it becomes really easy, because if you plug it into the quadratic formula, and we're plugging the 0 here. If we square 0, that's going to go away, right? That we know this is going to be 0 on the inside, so it's gone. So the only thing we're left to have to do is do the -b over 2a. So just be a little careful when you plug that in. The b was -4, so that's minus -4 over 2 times 2. So minus negative makes that a positive 4. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 over 4 is 1. So there's our one solution at x equals 1. Okay, so the discriminant just kind of helps you speed up the process a little bit and know what you need to do. If that number is 0 like this one was, well, that's great, because if you take the square root of 0, it doesn't do anything. It's still just 0, so that part's gone. So the only thing you have to do to find the answer is to do -b over 2a. Again, that's a problem that if we checked it, it probably is not going to, actually that one would have factored off. But if they tell you to do the discriminant, you kind of have to do that. Once you've got the discriminant, you know, this work down here is actually pretty easy. That's the hardest part, is getting the discriminant. Okay, so quadratic formula wise, that's what we're looking at. We're just going through those two parts of it, playing around with those numbers and just kind of working through it there.